All right, everybody, good evening and welcome to this virtual event for Majors and Quinn booksellers. My name is Steph. I am bookseller here at Majors and Quinn. For those who don't know, we are an independent bookstore in uptown Minneapolis, Minnesota. If this is your first time viewing one of our events, we're happy to have you. If not, welcome back. We appreciate that you continue to support our events program. This evening, I am so thrilled to introduce Tom Nichols, author of Our Own Worst Enemy. Tom is a professor of national security affairs, U.S. Naval War College, and a columnist for USA Today, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of The Death of Expertise, Oxford 2017, No Use, Nuclear Weapons and U.S. National Security 2013, and Eve of Destruction, The Coming Age of Preventive Warfare 2008. He is also an instructor at the Harvard Extension School and an adjunct professor at the U.S. Air Force School of Strategic Force Studies. He's a former aide in the U.S. Senate and has been a fellow of the International Security Program at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is joined tonight by the wonderful Joan Walsh. She is a national affairs correspondent for The Nation and appears regularly on MSNBC. She is the co-producer of the Emmy-nominated The Sit-In. Harry Belafonte hosts The Tonight Show, and the author of What's the Matter with White People? Why We Long for a Golden Age That Never Was. So before I hand it off to these two amazing people, please sound off in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Say hi and ask questions. We will have time for a short Q&A at the end. I'll come back to moderate. So as these two discuss, please put any comments or questions that you have in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. All right. With that said, I'll get out of your hair and let these two have at it. So thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Hello, everybody. Hey, Tom. So excited to do this. It's a serious read. It's a sobering read. It made me want to be a better person. I'm not sure I can say it's a beach read, but people might disagree about that. Somebody might think it is. But we're going to start with Tom doing a short reading from the book, and then I'll ask some questions. We'll have a conversation, and we will take your questions at the end, probably about 8:45. So 7:45. Sorry, I'm on East Coast time. I've gotten this wrong all day, but I'll try to catch up. So take it away, Tom.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Majors and Quinn for hosting this. And Joan, thank you so much for your time to join for a discussion. I'll start with something from one of the early chapters that I hope sets the tone of the problem that I was trying to wrestle with while I was dealing with trying to write this, about why things could be the way they are in the world, that is, say, a relatively prosperous and peaceful world, and yet we have become, and I say we, people in democracies around the world, not just the United States, have become so resentful and angry. So this is from the book, and it begins with these assaults on democratic norms, which I've talked about going on around the world, Italy, the United States, and other places. These assaults on democratic norms, as we will see, are coming from populations whose anger is rooted far more in notional injustices and imagined dangers than in actual harms. The dissatisfied, illiberal citizens of the early 21st century are not the armies of unemployed men marching on Washington during the Great Depression because their families were on the verge of starving. They are not the disenfranchised African Americans of the 1950s seeking to attend school without being murdered. They are not the poor of Appalachia sleeping on dirt floors in the 1960s while men orbited the planet in space. They are not the women of the 1970s who still needed their husband's permission to get a credit card or a divorce. They are not the gay and lesbian Americans of the 1980s who were told they could not marry. Instead, the threat to democracy now and in America and elsewhere comes from the working and middle classes, the people among whom I was born and raised, whose rage comes overwhelmingly from cultural insecurity, inflated expectations, tribal partisan alliances, obsessions about ethnicity and identity, blunted ambition, and a childlike understanding of the limits of government. Authoritarian systems are the authors of their own troubles and deserve every molecule of the opposition they face from within. But why are people who are already free and who are by any relative measure materially and politically better off than those in more repressive states, attacking their own systems of government? The answers are as disturbing as they are counterintuitive. We are losing because we won. We are suffering because we are successful. We are unhappy because we have what we want.
That's a great choice. That's a great way to kick us off. It reminds me, you write so evocatively about growing up in Chicopee, Massachusetts, at a time you say, we're roughly the same age, when the town's decline was already evident. It was not the heyday of Chicopee. And you've got this great, sad anecdote about a friend, various friends who think that it was this golden age. And one, I think, even reminisces about a plant near where you grew up and how it was thriving and throbbing with, manufacturing or whatever, just great things were going on. That's when things were great. And you had to say, well, no, actually, it was already shut down and we used to play there, in the ruins. So talk a little bit, you bring your friends to life, you try to be kind, but talk a little bit about that disconnect between what it was really like growing up and what people seem to remember, because I think it's common.
Yeah, obviously hearing my voice, people know I didn't grow up near Boston. I don't have that, particular accent. I grew up out in the Connecticut Valley. And when people hear Massachusetts, they think I grew up wearing Harvard sweaters and, singing the Whiff and Poof song and rowing on the Charles. I grew up in a factory town. I grew up my parents were Depression era kids. My mom had a 9th grade education. My dad had a 10th grade education. Life, we were like a lot of working and middle-class families. We were sort of prosperous, and then we were broke, and then we were prosperous, and then we were in hard times. But the thing that struck me about so many of the arguments about why people are mad at democracy is they say, well, things used to be really good and now they're really bad. One of the people that I've spoke to when I was writing the book was Ian Bremmer, who wrote about his childhood in a tough neighborhood in Massachusetts. And he said, things are bad. Now, Ian's a little younger than I am, but he said, people feel like they've been lied to, like something changed. And I said, Ian, when was this good time? Because I don't remember that. I mean, I remember growing up in the early 1970s in, the worst time. I mean, obviously not as bad as the Depression, but in my living memory, those are the times that I really remember as terrible. And that was a puzzle for me. And I talk a lot in the book about false nostalgia. And Joan, the anecdote you brought up about my friend, this factory, I grew up behind an American Legion post. So I grew up behind a bar. And my brother owned, for a time, another bar across the street. And that bar was next to the factory. Now, there were still some guys working in parts of this plant. And my brother would open at 7 a.m. to get the guys coming off shift. And yet my friend's like, no, that place was hopping all the time. And I said, we broke the windows in there when we were like 12. In 1973, I said that the railroad tracks, the little spur of the Boston and Maine Railroad, was already covered over by weeds. Now, there are still trains that go through there, but this part of the tracks that went to this factory, I said, what are you remembering? And he's, well, he kept going on. And I was like, this didn't happen. I said, this is not a real memory. And I wondered, how did people fall into the grip of this? Because, and as I make the point in the book, if you believe that stuff and that 1970 was a golden era, or 1980 was a golden time, again, 1980, people say the 1980s. Well, I'm sorry, but I was alive. I graduated into a 10% unemployment economy.
Same.
They then reached the conclusion, democracy has failed. That all forms of government are just wrong, and we need just a strong hand to make everybody fully employed. And it's literally crazy in the sense of being detached from reality.
Well, the subtitle of my book, as Steph said, was Why We Long for a Golden Age That Never Was. I guess one way I would maybe not disagree, but ask you about this. I think that there was a golden age earlier than us for white men, only, and it was the post World War II period when we were. You make the point. We were the manufacturing base for the destroyed economies of Europe and Japan, and we were also. I think there was a conscious project of creating a solid middle class, a growing middle class, because we, out of the fear of the Great Depression, fascism, and communism. And so I think there was a decision made to build a middle class. There was funding, there was education funding, there were roads, there was electrification, there was the GI Bill. Again, so much of this confined to white men, which is one reason I say it wasn't a golden age. But we did make a conscious decision to give more people opportunity and to reduce income inequality. And I wonder how you look at that.
I don't think it was a conscious decision to reduce income inequality. I think it was just there was stuff that had to be made, and factories were going to make it. And I don't think anybody was really driving policy. Even the Republicans of the 1950s or the Democrats of the 1960s, or again the Republican Democratic coalition of this, were saying, we really have to make sure that things are. They didn't have to make those hard decisions because there was a lot of money around for about 15 years. And it's interesting that you bring this up about a golden age, because after I wrote a piece in the Atlantic about this, where I talked about this, a guy sent me a letter who grew up in my hometown, but he grew up there about 13 or 14 years before I did.
Oh, interesting.
And he said, I really appreciate it, fellow hometown guy. And he said, but I graduated from high school in '65, and I remember Chicopee as being really great. And I said, yeah, for you, for about 10 years. And I said, and I notice you don't live there now. He went on and, became a professional. And I said, the other thing, and I brought this up to this old fellow townie guy of mine. I said, my dad and my brother were both cops on that force. I said, probably not a great place to be if you were a black man dealing with, the cops. And he said, you didn't even have to be a black man. He said, those were days where, and he suddenly started civil rights and people getting right. And, all of a sudden there was this sort of, I guess. But he said, but they had union jobs. And I'm like, what I remember was union jobs and a lot of alcoholism and spousal abuse and street violence and a lot of other things happening that we filter out. That's Joan, you've written about nostalgia. We filter out the bad stuff.
Right.
I mean, even me, I think of my childhood and I remember the candy store. I remember the barbershop, and these kind of Norman Rockwell sort of memories. But I also remember there was a really ugly underside to a lot of that period in history. But you're right that for about 15 years, there was this anchoring that people just have not let go of. And I say in the book that they pass these along now almost like campfire stories. In 1967, boy, you could go to Southern California and buy a house for peanuts because the defense industry was booming.
Right.
Well, okay, but things change, and that's not how that is anymore. And I think it is, and how hard this is for me as a former, moderate conservative guy back in my day to say I think it is bound up with whiteness, and I think it is bound up with being a guy. When people talk about, and I'll get off this soapbox now, but people talk about, 1970, a single male worker could sustain an apartment for his family of 4. Well, there were a lot of good reasons that was possible. Women were kept out of the workforce. Minorities were not really competitive for those jobs. And you had to be willing, and this is something people don't want to think about, you had to be willing to live in a 3-room apartment with 2 children.
Right.
Which no one would do now. The people would think that's oppression now. And so I think we just have and of course, what is always the answer? Not that there aren't problems. Income inequality is a real thing. Stagnating wages, all of those are real problems. But if your conclusion is always that this system of government, not any one political leader, not any one policy, but this entire experiment with freedom is somehow screwed up, then I think you have really been just poisoned by a kind of toxic nostalgia that is especially now fed, 24 hours a day through the internet and cable news and Facebook and places like that. Our generation, you and I, Joan, I would say most of the most illiberal attitudes in this country reside in people that are between 55 and 65.
Yeah, I would agree
It's
with
not
you.
a movement of the young. This isn't that, Steven Pinker once said something equivalent of nationalism is an old man's movement. And I think that's right. I think that's partly what we're seeing.
Well, excuse me, we're not old. What are you saying?
Well,
anyway,
mature, experienced.
Mature. No, I completely agree with you. I mean, you also talk about something that I also cover in my book, which is the Hat Riot of 1970.
Yes.
And, it's when these construction workers who were building the World Trade Center come down to an anti-war rally, mainly students, but some, it was the era of Mayor John Lindsay, who was kind of an elite liberal Republican. My father was there. So this is why it had such an impact.
The Hat Riot?
No, my dad was a protester. My dad.
Oh, okay.
It's a long story, but my dad actually got to go to college. He was sent away to the Christian Brothers, but his younger brothers who didn't get that opportunity didn't go to college, and they became steam fitters like my grandfather had. And so he sees his brother on the street, beating up. I don't know if he was beating up, but he was protesting the hippies and the long hairs and all the rest. And I'll never forget, my father tried to be kind about it, but he was like, guys like your uncle grew up thinking that they had it made and they would always be deferred to. At this point, their kids would listen to them. There wouldn't be these loud mouths. There wouldn't be these college graduates telling them that they're stupid. And it was, as much a perceived lack of respect as any kind of financial suffering, because they had, by the nature of their hard hats, they had great union jobs where lots of Black people and women were still excluded from those unions, or, they were very scarce. So I think that that's kind of this moment where history turns, and that illuminates so much and, opened up this stark divide in our family.
The thing about the quote I took from a new book on the Hat Riots that really jumped out at me was somebody being interviewed about it in 1970. And she said, no one listens to us.
Yep.
No one listens to us. And it's like, no, everyone listens to you. It's just like today, when people say, well, no one listens to us. What they mean is no one's doing exactly what we want. And we feel some kind of vague sense of disrespect, even though we give no respect. I mean, this is the other problem, and I used to have these kind of arguments with my own father, who was, pretty right-wing and kind of bigoted, very bigoted. But it's like, you can't demand that kind of deference, but give absolutely none. And it struck me, and I say in the book, this person says, no one listens to us. No one cares about the working people. Excuse me, you had just elected Richard Nixon. He'd been president for 2 years, and he was about to win in a landslide in 1972. The whole world was organized around listening to you. And the same people who make those arguments today, I would argue, exercise political power vastly out of proportion to their numbers in the population, because they are the loudest voices and they are listened to. Last time I came to Majors and Quinn, and I was talking about this book called The Death of Expertise, one of the things I used to hear in the audience all the time is, Washington doesn't listen to us. And I'm like, all Washington does is listen to you and try to give you all the things you want, which is why we have gigantic budget deficits and incomprehensibly conflicting policies and incoherent debates in Congress, because everybody just wants to do whatever it takes to stay in power. And they're doing we're seeing it right now, this whole pullout from Afghanistan. I can't believe Biden's pulling out from Afghanistan. You told him 80% of the people said do this.
Right.
But not this way. We didn't want it to be unpleasant. That sums up this whole kind of American attitude toward just give me the ice cream and don't tell me about the other stuff, and don't make me think about hard questions. And I think it really does begin sometime around the late 60s, early 70s. I think it becomes a kind of this kind of class. You know why we have more class conflict after the late 1960s? Because we have more classes.
Yeah.
And because people are, suddenly being, we now have a affluent working class instead of a really poor working class, and an educated working class on the GI Bill and other things. I'll add one other thing. When people look back and say, well, education was really cheap. Yeah, that's because nobody went to college.
Right.
Very few people. We didn't even have universal high school graduation. When I started college in 1979, 14% of American women had a college degree, and only about 33% of American men. So it's easy to have college not be a problem if no one goes.
Well, right. And, but we could have made decisions, but there are a whole lot of economic factors at play as well. But, I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, great school, and never paid more than $400 a semester. And I don't think it ever got to $400. It stayed somewhere between $300 and the high 300s. And so, they knew we were coming, and lots of decisions were made or not made, not to keep funding, not to keep building, not to figure out how to make that affordable to more people. And I really appreciate that you are willing and have been willing for quite a while to look at the role of race in this, because and feminism and gay rights to some extent, because it is that as those movements rose and people asked for more, suddenly we couldn't afford it. And there were some economic changes. It's a really complicated story to tell, when
I always think about the end of the public education boom. People ascribe it to ideology when in fact the baby boom was petering out, and people said, you know what, I don't have kids going anymore. I'm not going to pay for this. I mean, It just became part of this story that I tell in the book of this kind of almost village mentality. Right. Hey, I have kids, so it's good that the University of Wisconsin's cheap, or University of Massachusetts. I mean, this happened in liberal states too, where a bunch of people just, I don't have kids anymore, so screw it. We're not going to pay for colleges. And I said to someone the other day when they were talking to me about this, I said, if the Commonwealth, my hometown, my home state, Commonwealth of Massachusetts wanted to make all higher education free, they could do it tomorrow. They could do it tomorrow. They just don't want to, because we have other priorities now. And even, people who normally would feel this kind of outreach to others, we've just decided, me, my moat, my castle, and that's overtaken it. And you can't, the bottom line about this with the book is you can't sustain a democracy on this. You can't sustain a democracy on me and my clan, and everybody else doesn't matter.
Go to hell. Yeah. It's interesting because another factor here, to an extent, and I'm leaving aside economic forces, which is not always a good idea, but bear with me. I've thought often about how, speaking of enemies, losing the Soviet Union as an enemy had some downsides, and one of them was, there's lots of writing, I've covered it a lot about the civil rights movement that showed the Kennedys and Johnson, but especially the Kennedys, were really sensitive, and Khrushchev was very bold and canny about making a mockery of our democracy when Black people in the South couldn't vote and Black people in the North faced all kinds of other obstacles. And it's like losing that enemy, and that sense that we've got to be ideologically live up to our values more. Really does seem to me to be part of the story.
It's and it's a crucial part of the story. I began my career as a Soviet expert. I was a Cold War guy, and that classic whataboutism was always a challenge to us to live up. The Soviets, in a way, were constantly challenging us. If you're going to criticize us, then you'd better be purer than Caesar's wife. And the Russian expression was "A u vas negrov lynchuyut," meaning, and you lynch Negroes. You'd say, you guys are terrible. You oppress people, gulags, and they'd say, and you lynch, "A u vas negrov lynchuyut," and I mean, wow, and you'd say, well, okay, we're not perfect, but unlike you, we're trying to be better. I think the other thing that happens with the fall of the Soviet Union is that we lose any sense of seriousness. We lose any sense that anything matters. I was 31 when the Berlin Wall came down, and all my life I had lived with this idea that there is another alternative to the system I'm living in. I saw it with my own eyes. I went there. There is a real place that is this kind of through the looking glass nightmare. And I don't think people have any sense of, even China, they look at China and they see big gleaming cities and they see Batman jumping off of skyscrapers in Shanghai. And they see kind of, this far away, but very rich people that are trading with us and everything's made there. I don't think they wake up every morning with this just little iota of seriousness that says there are 12,000 nuclear warheads pointed at this country right now, and all of everything could end in 26 minutes. And, nobody walked around some of us, I guess, walked around worrying about that all day. Sorry, I worked on it, so I was pretty worried about it all day. But there was still this sense that things matter, that you can't just become complete, that you simply can't just hang around at the arcade all day and say, communism, whatever. And now we use those words as meaningless. We throw over fascist, communist, socialist. People have no idea what they're talking about.
No, absolutely. There's a moving part early in your book where you are having a conversation with your dad, who's quite sick, and you say, he's, perhaps he's a bigot, but
definitely a bigot.
Okay,
but
yeah, I don't like to say that about anybody else's dad, but you do say it.
He was my dad, and I loved him, but yeah.
Okay, you say it in the book, but. And it's right before it was Obama versus Mitt Romney. And he says, I'm paraphrasing now, I don't remember exactly, but he says something to the effect of, well, we'll be okay, whoever wins. And, it was so striking to me because, to be honest, I knew that basically now that we've lived through Trump. But at the time, I personally felt I felt that if Mitt Romney had run as the Massachusetts governor that he was, I think he could have beaten Obama, because I don't think that the base was as crazy and riled up as it became. But I thought there was a lot at stake. And I also thought, last thought on poor Mitt Romney, who is doing a lot of good things. He courted Donald Trump. He wanted his endorsement. I think he went to Las Vegas to accept it, and he had a very sheepish look on his face. I do remember that. But he and Newt Gingrich fought over the endorsement. So, he played a role too in centering more the role of race and racial resentment, but it was nothing compared to Trump. And it just strikes me that in 9 short years since you had that conversation with your father, it would be very hard for a conservative who hated Obama to say that or admit that. I just wonder how you think about it now.
Yeah, there's a couple of things about that story. One is that the point really, whatever my father's other flaws, and he was a man. He was born in 1918, and he grew up, dirt poor, and he had a lot of those attitudes that he carried with him. I don't think my father stopped using the N-word casually until somewhere in the 1980s, early 1990s, partly because his adult children just kept giving him the stink eye and saying, enough, Dad. Right. And I think, but as I always tell this story too, my father was always that guy who's watching TV and he says, how come all the police captains are women, and how come all the judges are black guys, like he just felt this kind of low level irritation from the culture. At one point he said something like, well, why is this, national security advisor? And I said, Dad, Condi Rice is actually the Secretary of State. I think, it's probably time you can do this. And, but he had a reverence for the American system of government. And he had been, like a lot of white working class guys, he'd been a Democrat, still thought you couldn't speak a word against FDR in our house. You just didn't. Right. And, when he didn't, and he also believed that the offices were sacred. He never talked that way about Barack Obama, either as a candidate or as president, because in my house, you did not talk that way about the president of the United States. It just was wrong. And he was soon to die. We knew he was ill, but he was in assisted living. And I said, Dad, I think, Romney's not going to make it here. And my father just kind of nodded and he said, they're both good men. He said, we're going to be fine no matter who wins. Well, they're both good men. And I think the other thing that comes out of that is there was a time that you could deeply disagree the way you and I do, about 9 million things and say, but it's not the end of the world.
Right.
It is not this constant, and I think the real irony here is that when Donald Trump was going to be reelected, I finally felt like this could be the last election. Like this, we're now dealing with a party in America that is actually an authoritarian party whose goal is to not let any more fair elections take place. And I remember that business, I think part of just to fess up the sins of the moderate Republicans. I was a Massachusetts, Northeastern Republican. I worked for John Hines of Pennsylvania, who today probably wouldn't even be allowed in the Republican Party.
Right.
But I think we just didn't want to look and see who else was with us on that bus. We thought, there's always, every party has crazies, and some of these people are, terrible. But by and large, most of us are sane and care about things like tax rates and defense spending and
regulation of business.
Yeah, I mean, I think Romney just figured, well, I got to go get this guy's nod, and it's going to suck, and I'm shoring up some, part of the flank. But we were wrong. I mean, we just were wrong not to realize, first of all, that wing of the party was going to take over the primary process. But also, I think we underestimated the existence of this 24-hour news cable channel that was doing nothing but making people completely psychotic after a while. And, that didn't exist in the 80s and 90s. And we just thought, I really had hoped, I had totally thought that at some point, all the other Republicans were going to look at Donald Trump and say, you're not welcome here. The way they did with David Duke in 1991.
Yeah.
When George H.W. Bush said, well, I always end up doing Dana Carvey doing Bush, but it's not a Republican, not my kind of guy, not welcome in our party, and now it's like, well, okay, I guess he's getting 30% of the primary vote, so I guess we have to let him in. And in the book, I talk about how parties have to stop doing that. Both parties have to stop being vehicles for entrepreneurs. And I'm just going to slam Bernie Sanders for a minute and say, if you want the nomination of the Democratic Party, maybe you ought to be a Democrat. Maybe you ought to actually join the party. But the parties have become flags of convenience for these big coalitions led by very charismatic folks. And the reason the Republicans, I think, were especially vulnerable to this, aside from, the white anxiety and all that other stuff, is that they're a very disciplined party. It's hard to take over the Democratic Party. You guys you're like trying to herd cats. The Republicans, if you can grab the top of that thing, you have like an automatic built-in vote, because Republicans are very disciplined about showing up. And I think all those flaws were there, and we just assumed that, like my father, we said, oh, there's mostly good people around, we'll be okay. And the book, in part, was because I wanted to ask the question, what if there aren't a lot of good people around?
Right.
What if in Britain or Italy or Poland or Hungary or Turkey, there are enough people who say, yeah, I'm not interested in being a good person. I'm interested in punishing other people and hurting them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, thinking back on that 2016 primary, a lot of those guys did try temporarily to say Donald Trump is a terrible person. He's a liar. All the famous things that Lindsey Graham said. Say it again.
I said, but they couldn't stick to it because they're cowards.
They couldn't stick to it. And I don't think I foresaw that. I was always waiting also. I didn't like them. I admit it, but I was always waiting for somebody to come together and say, or a group of people to come together and say, okay, this is the candidate and we're going to unite behind him or her. Like
I made arguments in public saying Donald Trump should not be allowed to run as a Republican. He shouldn't be given space on the stage. He should be told his, what the poisonous stuff he's selling is not welcome in a major American political party. And people who should have known better kind of shouted me down saying, well, the will of the people. And I'm like, well, parties stand for something besides, particularly in the 2016 election, where a lot of the people voting in the Republican primary were never Republicans. I mean, again, we have this kind of political tourism that happens where people just show up. And I talk about this in the book where people said, wouldn't it be just hilarious to nominate Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great to just see what happens, to throw that turd in the punch bowl? And I think, that's just a sign of being an unserious people.
Right. You also identify something that I've written about, which was the Bernie Trump voter or the Trump Bernie voter, which again, given that the extent to which genuine economic anxiety as we were all told we had to bow to, drove that. You've shown very well it didn't. But I think the way we really saw that was when, that it was really about Hillary Clinton more than anything else, and a little bit about adventurism, and they're both bomb throwers, and that's a good thing rather than a bad thing. But it was proven, and it got so little attention. But Bernie won the West Virginia primary in 2016. Bernie won the Michigan primary. I believe he won Wisconsin. Biden then, not being Hillary, 4 years later, won all of those. And there was a significant number of Trump voters, basically, people who would go on to support Trump, who supported Bernie in that primary round. And so, yeah, I mean, the blurring of party lines.
I added a few other stories to that, though. One of my favorite, and I had to keep reading it, and I went, because I couldn't believe it happened, was the Iowa caucus voter who said, well, I think my first choice is Pete Buttigieg, but if he can't make it, I guess I'll vote for Trump. I'm like, what? How does that even work? Well, I guess, I voted for Sanders, and I voted for Trump the last time, and I was kind of hoping for Bernie, but now I'm really for Buttigieg. And then Tim Alberta had a great story about going to Pennsylvania and saying, he said the Democratic Party is just I can't vote for Biden because the Democratic Party is just too far to the left for me. I could have voted for Sanders or Buttigieg, but I can't go with Biden because it's just too far to the left. And you find yourself saying, again, these are fundamentally unserious views. This is just mediated through television. These are people who are saying, look, I want it to be interesting.
Right. I'm bored. I'm bored,
I'm bored. Right. That, and I, one of the things, I know we talked about was, that's partly what's driving a lot of this rage. It's not people who are poor, it's people who are bored. And Eric Hoffer, this is not a new observation. Eric Hoffer, 70 years ago, he said, if you're really worried about a mass takeover, a mass movement, the real worry is not widespread economic misery, it's widespread boredom, because people want to feel like their lives are interesting and important. And I think January 6th, which, we haven't talked about, but it's in the book, and I'm sure we'll take some questions about it, was a bored middle class, basically. These were not poor people. People went on chartered jets to say, I'm going to have a day spa outing overturning democracy, and then I'm going to post about it on Instagram.
Right. So, explain January 6th to us. And are we taking it seriously even now?
No, we're not. I mean, this is, I'm with George Will. I know not a beloved finger on the left, but George Will said 1/6 should be burned into our memory the way 9/11 is.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, that day should be this black day in American history. And we should be Congress. I mean, I can't believe Congress is even in recess. I mean, there should be nothing but we are going to defend democracy and get to the bottom of this whole mess. And instead, it's like, what are you going to do? These people just showed up and they turned into a flash mob. Mo Brooks is still sitting in Congress and still saying the same stuff.
Mo Brooks just last week kind of gave a little aid and comfort to the crazy guy who, said he had a bomb and, was.
Right. I'm not saying I would have done it, but I understand, that kind of,
socialism is coming and we've got to fight socialism.
And I think if you are a bored, moderately unsuccessful real estate agent in Texas, what could be better than to say, I'm going to go to Washington and I'm going to be part of this great dramatic thing that's going to define my life and make me feel like I'm meaning, and I'm going to find a tribe of people and we're all going to wear costumes. I mean, you saw this with the Tea Party development.
Yes.
And I have to say that I was a avowed enemy of the Tea Party from the right. I said, this is unserious. This is basically childish. I said, I think it's motivated by racism. I mean, I took a lot of arrows.
Very few people, very few conservatives would say that. I got so much guff for saying that. It was really identity politics for white people. And it was really a sign because it was driven so much by a backlash to Obama's election. They could say that it was about the stimulus and the deficit, but it wasn't. And we know that because once, Trump blew up the budget with both spending and tax cuts, there was not a peep out of anybody affiliated with the Tea Party, or maybe somebody that we'd never heard of. But, you know,
the essential incoherence of the Tea Party movement, you know, all of the things that were anathema to the Tea Party all became dogma under Trump because it was okay now. Because if we do it, it's all right.
Right.
And I think this is again, I think it is much more toxic on the right, but this is a national disease now. And you see it again. You see it in the UK. You see it in the Brexit debate. You see it in Italy with the 5-star movement. You see it in Poland and Hungary and other places, that all the things my opponents do are terrible until I do them. And then they're okay because I just want to win. I just want to be on the right team because I'm bored and it feels good. I mean, you know, just to put this in a comparative context for a minute, one of the other things that kind of motivated me early on as a former Soviet East European guy was the amazing Polish anti-Muslim movement. And for people who are wondering why it's amazing that Poland has an anti-Muslim movement, it's because there are no Muslims in Poland.
Right.
You know, it's a notional movement of peace, saying, well, we're not going to be taken over by the Muslims. Well, okay, I don't think you're really in any danger of that. But if that's your new hobby, then that becomes, you know, this kind of guiding, you know, what Hoffer called this great crusade. This, you know, he said, if you take away that, you leave our lives puny and meaningless. And I think people have just said, I want to be, we think about the fact that in the last 20 years, the most popular movies in America are superhero movies. That's what we watch. That's who we are.
Right.
Should we take questions? Are we?
I think we're getting close. Steph, do we have questions?
Hi. Yeah. Alrighty. We have.
Sorry, Joan. I didn't mean to cut you off on any. I just
no. That's great.
If we were supposed to do some Q&A, but.
Yeah. I mean, we are always welcome to, you know, expound on any of these.
How could anybody disagree with any of this? It's totally uncontroversial.
Exactly. All right. So let's start off with one from Paul in Long Beach, who says, Tom, you've often spoken of a narcissistic tendency within modern culture. Can you please expand on social media's role in this phenomenon?
Wonderful question. Thank you, Paul. Because that's the word, you know, Joan and I became such an interesting conversation. I forgot to bring up that the root cause of all of this in the book is a 40-year pandemic of narcissism. And it's global and it's empirical. It's like social psychologists are actually tracking this around the world. And I think it's because affluence lets us do things alone. We don't need to cooperate as much. We don't spend as much time in common workplaces. And social media puts that narcissism on steroids. Remember that the most important book about narcissism as a cultural trend, called The Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch, was written in 1979. That's how far back this goes, which means Lasch wrote it in like 77, 78 and published it in 79. Like, it was already obvious then. And he talked about the performative culture, the hatred of democratic rules because they should apply to everybody but you because you're the special boy. You know, all of that. And I think that has been just pumped up and become almost impossible to contain with people who are bored all day and say, well, I can't just be what I am. I'm going to go on Facebook and I'm going to be the guy who saves children from pedophiles. I'm going to be the guy who uncovers the plot to take down the Twin Towers because now my life is interesting. And it's all about me and my importance. And I think the other thing that happens through social media, just to tee off from Paul's comment a bit, is that social media puts a lot of different cultures in America in direct competition with each other every day because they're spending time staring at each other all day. You know, when we talk about this, the Eastern elites, you know, like the disgusting campaign run by people like J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance talking about, you know, the miserable East Coast elitists and the big city and the San Franciscans. You know, there was a time that people in Ohio couldn't have given a damn what people in San Francisco do. They didn't want to live there. They didn't want to know them. They didn't want to eat the same food they did. You know, you didn't have people walk around saying, in Ohio, saying, well, we have good sushi too, you know. They said, hey, we have barbecue. We don't want to be there. Social media says, all these cultures are competing, and the cool cultures are on the coast. And if you're not part of that, you're losing. And then people, it makes people nuts. And I was on a radio show in Omaha a while back, and someone said, what's the advice you have for people in Nebraska and here in the Midwest? And I said, you live in a great place. Stop comparing yourself to where everybody else lives. That becomes this is all about me, and the people in San Francisco don't like me and I don't like them. How about we just leave each other alone all day instead of thinking about this constantly? But social media doesn't allow, and before anybody says anything, I know I'm part of the problem. I'm on social media. I am part of that environment. I try not to be that way, but I am human and have my frailties and vanities as well. But the combination of narcissism and this constant cultural friction between people who don't need to be constantly measuring each other is literally making us crazy, I think, and violent and angry and unhappy and depressed.
Yeah, thank you. Here is another one. This one from Vaughn. What do you think Ronald Reagan's role is in accelerating the dynamics your book explores?
Ronald Reagan, of course, is the original sin of all bad things in 21st century America for some folks. And I just don't buy that. I think the things I would identify as the great sins of the Reagan administration were style over substance in some cases. That, Reagan's ability to disarm his critics with a quip or a smile or a joke it really elided the necessity to give real answers sometimes. And I think that was part of that. The politicians that I think of as alike are people like JFK, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, people who could just somehow blast this kind of charisma through a television tube, because that is what America wanted. We don't want boring politicians. We want interesting politicians. A lot of times people will raise the government is the problem thing about Reagan. And I think the only defense, look, I just don't, I voted for Ronald Reagan. I don't hate him the way a lot of folks do. And the only thing I will say is that to understand Ronald Reagan, you had to understand the 1970s. You had to have lived through the 70s first to understand why that message was appealing. Particularly through the Cold War and the economic downturn of the 70s. Now, with that said, again, I think Reagan kind of created this, the president is a god who can just solve things, and Congress is just an impediment, and I think that was a trend that was already underway, and Reagan really accelerated it. Charm is overrated. When they called Reagan the great communicator, I don't think he should have been able to get off the hook. I think the great sin of the Reagan administration was Iran-Contra, because I'm a foreign policy guy. And I think that was straight up violation of the Constitution. It was easily impeachable. I hated Oliver North. Even in the 80s, I thought it was appalling to stand in front of Congress and say, I'm not answering your questions, But for Reagan to be able to say, well, I'm doing my second president impression. Well, I thought I didn't do it, but the facts tell me I did it. Well, no, that's not an answer.
No.
And people accepted it because they said, okay, I like him. He's a good guy. He's charming and, famous. And I think that was an unfortunate, I think that if you want to really blame the Reagan administration for the road we're on now, but I'm going to be bipartisan about this and say, a lack of seriousness, the idea that character doesn't matter in the White House, that, it doesn't matter if the president's a bad guy. That sinking feeling first struck me in 1992 with Clinton. I was kind of glad. George H.W. Bush was my idea of, kind of dull, wonky, workman-like, experienced president. People think Reagan's my favorite president. I'm actually kind of a Bush 41 guy because that's when I worked in Washington. But I think by, this combination of the Cold War being over and boom times coming, by the mid 1990s, I just felt like we had now experienced a lot of years of basic unseriousness about politics. So that's my acknowledgement that, yes, Reagan created some of these problems, but I'm going to take a pot shot at Bill Clinton while I'm at it, because I still think that was actually an important part of that process too.
Here's one that's sort of connected from Terrence. I remember a video of GOP voters asking Reagan and GHW Bush about their pro-immigration platform. These were young voters who are still alive. What changed after Reagan signed the amnesty law?
Actually, it's a great question because people forget when they say, Reagan did all these. I mean, Reagan was actually in hot water with a lot of far-right Republicans by 1985. The evangelicals were mad at him because, amazingly, abortion was still legal and kids weren't praying in schools yet, which they somehow thought was going to happen. And Reagan does this massive amnesty. But the thing that changed, and I think this is the most important thing about it, is that the Republican Party, whether you agreed with it or not, the Republican Party was an optimistic party. And this is one of the things, again, if you understand the 1970s, which were such a dark time, Reagan projected this kind of optimism, say, no, the game's not over. The Soviet Union is not going to win. Vietnam is not irreparable. All of these kind of very positive, the Morning in America message. Bush 41 doing the, gonna get out 1,000 points of light. But what changed is that Republicans started to realize that demography is turning against them. And my friend David Frum has a great line. He says, if Republicans have to choose between democracy and being in power, they're not going to side with democracy anymore. And they've determined, and I think this is where a lot of us broke with the party, and I think where the party turned, somewhere in the 90s, people like Gingrich said, you know what, we're not really about parties or platforms. We're about staying in power at all costs.
Right.
And if that means burning everything down, then so be it. And by the 2000s, where the demographic shift is clearly moving against Republicans, they've said, if we have to govern by minority rule through anti-democratic means, so be it. And I think that's what the Republican Party, I can tell you that I've talked about this with other people who in their youth were Republicans, to say, we were the optimistic ones. We were the ones, the Democrats were the ones who were saying decline and managing the collapse. NATO's not going to last and the American dream is, and the Republicans were the ones who are saying, no, we're a can-do country. And the Republicans now are the people saying, American carnage. I mean, Trump's inauguration. Remember what George Bush said about Trump's inauguration speech. Trump finishes and Bush turns to somebody and says, that was some weird shit. And I watched it and I said, that is the most screwed up. I didn't use that word, but I said, that was the most screwed up thing I have ever seen in American politics. This kind of, Trump gave a speech that is the kind of speech you give if you are a defeated nation after a war.
Exactly.
He sounded like he was standing in the rubble of Berlin saying, we shall rebuild and the enemy will be vanquished and, hard times and we shall eat bread and grass. And, and I'm like, this victim mentality, this grievance laden victim mentality that I think goes back to Joan's point about, this sense of white grievance and that other people are finally emerging into the public sphere. Just drives this kind of florid paranoia that nothing is ever going to be good again. One of my friends who said to me, and I quote him in the book, he said, nothing's been good since Reagan. And I'm like, that's not true. You got me. We've known each other for 40 years. That's literally not. But again, it's like, nope, that's it. Everything's, turn out the lights. We're doomed. It's over. And that was never in the Republican Party that I knew until the midnight, until I came home from Washington after my stint in the Senate, and I started to realize that these guys are just becoming dark and choleric and dyspeptic and horrible, and it was depressing to talk to them. And what they were really talking about is, we're going to start losing elections, that things are going to change.
Yeah. All right.
I should add one thing and say, what was interesting to me is that the center right was actually controlling the country, and I remember thinking, if the Republicans don't nominate Donald Trump, the country's going to be in this kind of this period of relative truce. The conservatives had won the economic fight about how the economy is organized. I mean, even Barack Obama didn't challenge that, and the liberals had won the culture war, which no one was going to turn back. I mean, just that hash had been settled somewhere in the 1970s. And so there was this kind of, the country is sort of this moderately, kind of, at least on the macro sense, a center-right country, but with liberal and conservative pockets. And then the whole thing just comes apart I think, when people have to choose sides over the personality cult that was represented by Donald Trump. And I think, it's always important to point out that Trump had no real programmatic interest in anything. It was purely about power, and it was just about being in power. There's that great scene, and I don't want to push another book other than my own, but at the beginning of Bob Woodward's book, there's this great conversation where Bannon says to him, you're a pro-choice Democrat. And he goes, okay, fine, I'm not. Like, okay, I'll just take this jacket off. You donated to these. Okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. Well, you were pro-choice. Okay, I'm not anymore. And I think that really revealed a weakness in the Republicans of, look, we don't really care what the policy is about. We just want to be in power and own stuff and be in charge. And that just, to me, is un-American and undemocratic in every way.
Thank you. Alrighty, we've got a few more in the chat. From Ellen, would mandatory national service change anything?
In the book, I talk about a summer of service or something, and I made it short, and I made it not too offensive, and I didn't make it like picking up trash along the highway, because I think that's turned into paid internships. A summer where between 17 and 19 or something, you just have to learn to make your bed and get up at 6 a.m. and learn how to, stand still. And I wanted to make it short so that it would be a common experience for everyone that people couldn't get out of by saying it's too hard, it's too long, it's too this, it's too that, because we don't have any common experiences anymore.
Right.
So I'm not in favor of a draft, but I think it would be really interesting to create a pool of young Americans, male and female, and that after they're done, to hand them a certificate that says, if your country ever needs you in a national emergency, you are qualified to help now. Congratulations. You now have done something where you've learned how to, fire a gun, operate heavy machinery, direct traffic, whatever it is. You now have this little bit of veteran status, because I talk in the book about what I call the new Spartanism, that we have started to fetishize military service to like Starship Troopers levels. Yeah. And it's really scaring me. And I'm supposed to tell you, I won't work there much longer because I'm leaving federal service eventually, but I don't represent the Defense Department. And it bothers me. And I think it bothers a lot of military people with the thank you for your service, and here's your first class seat, and here's your special seat at the restaurant. We're almost becoming Sovietized in these rituals of, wearing your medals and, your license plates and your flags. And, I think that's, I tell a story in the book where one of the people I grew up with, I didn't know until he died when I was a grown man that he'd gotten the Silver Star for wiping out a machine gun nest in Germany, like saved his whole, at Normandy rather, saved his whole platoon, squad, like get platoons that move forward, the whole thing. And I said, how did I not know this? And my dad said he didn't like to talk about it. It was not something he discussed. He went back to his job running a cleaning goods company in Massachusetts. And what he did there was what he did there because his country asked him to do it. And I would like to get back to something like that instead of this kind of Spartan-like, real citizens have killed people in combat, and maybe giving everybody a little taste of that to say, yeah, I've been on a military base. Yeah, I had to sleep in a uncomfortable bed for a couple of weeks. Sure, but I don't think a draft is the answer. And I don't think it would fly, and I don't think the American people would ever stand for it. So I don't think that.
All right. Looks like we have time for about one more before we go to our last question, though. I just want to tell everybody that if they'd like to purchase Our Own Worst Enemy or any of the other Tom or Joan's other works, to please give us a call. I am putting our number in the chat right now. Unfortunately, our website's having a little bit of issues processing credit cards, but if you call over the phone, we are happy to ship anywhere in the United States or outside of the United States. So please support these two wonderful people. And with that, maybe this one from CJ, who asks, Professor Nichols, please elaborate on the forces you think most responsible for reducing our vision of ourselves as a shining city on the hill to the grain on the hill, or the grain hill, sorry.
I think we made choices about things like consumerism, where we defined ourselves in terms of, what we could buy and how comfortable our lives were. We totally ignored the rest of the world. I mean, it was a great source of pride to me as a kid. The first time I ever left, I had relatives in southern Greece because my family's all, grandparents were all immigrants. To have an American passport, to say, yeah, we are the leader of this, thing called democracy, and yes, we are, part of this alliance that is defending something worth defending, even if we're all imperfect. And I think people now, like I pointed out about North Korea, only about 32% of people can identify where North Korea is on a map, and it's a peninsula. I mean, it's not like trying to identify Burundi, and but they have strong opinions about it. So I have deep thoughts about North Korea. Where is it? I don't know. So I think consumerism, narcissism, and solitariness, there's so much of what we do now is alone. I gave a shout out in the book to Robert Putnam's classic book, Bowling Alone. People don't join things. I said the other day, talking about this, a friend of mine pointed out years ago, people used to have porches, now they have decks. They used to sit in front of their house, now they sit behind them. They used to join the Elks, the Masons, the Moose, what was the Cramdens and the Raccoons, whatever. They don't join any of these organizations anymore. They sit at home. They say, want to go to the movies? Let's not go to the movies. I have a 50-inch screen. I can order up any movie in the world I want to see. Again, this is part of the price we pay for affluence and convenience, that we just don't leave the house and engage with other people, even in the most ordinary ways. I mean, I miss the days. I was thinking about this with movies the other day. I went to see, this shows you how, Joan, now I'm going to do the I'm old thing, but I was going to see Superman 2. And there was a line around the corner for this movie no one had heard of called Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I was like, what's this about? But you know what? There was this thing where everybody got together and they heard this cool thing, and Harrison Ford was in it, and everybody got together, and the theater whooped and hollered. People are losing that because they're choosing to just say, other people suck. I'll just stay home. I don't need to go to a theater. I don't. Even casinos. Now I'm a recreational gambler. I enjoy it. People say, I want to play blackjack. I'll play online. I'll play on my phone. And I think that all of these together have really conspired to turn us into this kind of sullen, gray, slightly paranoid, constantly resentful people that cannot, I'm sorry to end it on such a bummer of a note, but who cannot sustain the civic attitudes that undergird a liberal democracy. And we're running out of time. We're going to have to change sooner rather than later. And I hope we do.
Well, I think it's kind of fitting to end on a call to action almost.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Joan, for this wonderful event. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. We're so happy that you chose to spend your evening with us. And again, give us a call, order the books, support these two wonderful people. Tom, Joan, if there are any closing remarks you'd like to make, now's the time.
I just want to thank you again. I want to thank Majors and Quinn, and really thank you so much to Joan for being my conversation partner here tonight. I really appreciate it.
It was a lot of fun.
And thank all of you.
Yes, thanks everybody.
All right. Well, good night, everyone.
Good night.